Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. This is Joe, the bearded historian. He'll tell you an interesting story. Be careful of his soldiers, they can be brats. This is Angel, she's an entity. She'll cause chaos and plant her hands at you. This is Sue, she likes spirits, not the alcohol. She's the reason this channel exists. This is David, he likes fire trucks. He's here occasionally. Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. We preserve his story. Welcome to February and our first video of February. Next week I will be working on our 2600. It's a lot of files. Good thing I don't have to keep track of you peoples. I have a stack like way up here. Anyway, I'll be going through that shout out, or starting that shout out. I'll be recording it this week and hopefully posting it next week. This is a video, a continuation of Fridays, where we actually go inside for the stories. They weren't sure they were going to do this part because, well, you'll see later. But this is the beginning of the stories. It's inside, and it's dark, but it's fun. Enjoy. Are you ready? Here we go. Shout out time. Here's a shout out just for you. You support me, so I support you. This shout out is for our friends. Let's see who it is today. Ready? We've got animals. I forgot to set it. Hang on a minute. Alright, here we go. Alright. There's She Stole. There's, let's see, it's hard to read. Debbie Catching. Marcus. Amanda. Travis. Rock. Nacho Daily. Gloria. Rye. Let's see. Walker, Goldie, Moonsea, Alice, Blended, Face, Debbie, Light, Paralife, Ellen, excuse me, Hillbillies, A&M. Hold on a minute. Alright, so this is Mark and Allison, and they do prospecting, creeks, rivers, and things like that in Canada. So we've got some more Canadians. See, there's prospecting. We've got some shorts. A cool little bird. That's very cool. Got a nice catch. And then heads. Although it's personalized in the wild, but that's okay. So if you're into prospecting, that's a good place to go. Check them out, like, share, comment, and enjoy your video.
Ooh, quiet group in here, quiet group. Well, hey folks, I'll give a few minutes intro prior to the start. We're at about 7:52, so I think you all are the brave souls that we'll more than likely have this evening. So first and foremost, good evening. My name is Casey Osbach. I'm a supervisory park ranger historian here at Fort Laramie. So I've got the greatest job in the world. I get to walk with Joe here every morning out here at the Grand Old Post, and it's a wonderful job. This is a world-recognized historic site, folks, right here in southeast Wyoming. It is 56 years of unbelievable history, that real collage from the earliest fur trade days in 1834 and 1841, Fort William, Fort John, and then the military arriving here in 1849. So from 1849 to 1890, the U.S. military would occupy this area. And of course, as many of you know, if you remember your fourth grade Wyoming history, in fact, we had a little over 2,000 fourth grade students here between mid-April and May. Believe me, I like to talk and talk a lot, but they bore me out. Worth every second. They're our most important visitors. But truly amazing 41-year military history. Three themes before we start into Marla Matkin's presentation here. Three themes, if you go away with anything to encapsulate those 56 years. And that will be the cultural crossroads. Two rivers, when you crossed over that cement bridge Down yonder, of course, you saw that unbelievable iron bridge built in 1875. That's the North Platte River, of course. The Platte meaning flat, mile wide, foot deep, often very treacherous in the spring. And then the Laramie River. The Laramie River just kind of meanders right around the post, coming in from the southwest and then around to the east. Those two rivers, folks, is the DNA when they converge. If it wasn't for those two rivers converging here, none of this would be here. So those two rivers is really that spark plug, that magnet, that has brought folks in here for thousands of years, a true cultural crossroads. Secondly, and something to be proud of in southeast Wyoming, the global economic aspect of the first two fur trade forts, Fort William and Fort John. Believe it or not, the first business in the state of Wyoming was not at Yellowstone, it was not at Jackson Hole, it was here in Goshen County in southeast Wyoming, and that would have been Fort William in 1834, followed by Fort John. Both of those fur trade forts really brought in hundreds upon hundreds of tribal folks in here to trade and so forth. And then lastly, something that's very, very relevant to today, and that is our diplomatic aspect, the Embassy on the Plains. Embassy on the Plains being linked to the 1851 Horse Creek Treaty and the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. So we still have a lot of our tribal partners and friends, a little over 25 tribes that still look at Fort Laramie as being very important. Sorry, come on in, folks.
Way to make an interest, Stace.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, come on in. There should be some seats back there. So we still look at that Fort Laramie Treaty as being very, very important. Okay, Marla, what time do we have, folks? I can keep on time. Let me go. Oh, perfect. All right, I think we're good. Let me peek out one more time. Hey, Rob, I left that over just to potentially get some air. Yeah, just to get some air there. Yeah, come on in, folks, and then we'll start up. I'm not sure, Rob, if there was any more seats. Actually, this will be a good crowd because we're maxed out in this neighborhood.
Wow.
Come on in, and we're going to start out. Welcome, welcome. Come on in. You got your umbrella? You are set. Okay, folks, come on in. All right, ladies and gentlemen, so that's a nice 3 themes encapsulate 56 years. I think I might have done that within 5 minutes, which is amazing. Thank you. So without further ado, I want to introduce Marla Matkins, phenomenal historian. I've known Marla for a number of years. She's been here over 20-some years, helping us out as an export historian. She's from Kansas. For many years, Marla did theatrics. She's a teacher, she's a published author, and so forth, and really a specialist when it comes to U.S. Army dependents, officers' wives, families, and so forth. And that's an area that we don't totally always focus on at these Western military posts. Marla's done a phenomenal job over the years, and we really look at her as that expert, not only within the old Army of the West, but that sort of category that's so important, and that would be those wives, those families, and so forth that also went through the trials and tribulations of the American West. Fort Laramie defines the American West. These wives and these military cultures out here truly experienced all of this. So we are super delighted to have Marla here. We've had some good phone conversations over the past few months. We always look forward to having her trail inbound and see her over the horizon. So without further ado, I'm going to yield the floor. Thank you, Marla, for being here very much, and we're glad to have you. So I'm going to step out and around, and we'll yield the floor. Thank you, Marla.
Red Cloud came in the morning. I ordered lunch for him, and he had a rather large dish of preserves and enjoyed 2 cups of tea. He always enjoyed a good cup of tea. So did I, and Ada Voges. So that justifies the title of this program, which is Ada Voges and Tea Time with the Indians. Now, the impact of officers' wives and accompanying females was substantial on surrounding military posts as well as indigenous people. These women had ways that were prohibited to the officers of asserting their personal knowledge of the conditions in the West, as well as the government's relations with the tribes. And this was very important, and because it affected the opinions and the preconceived notions of people in the East who had never been out here. Now, many of these women were relatively well educated for ladies of their time. They were able to write and express themselves well. They were active participants and recorders of a significant period of change in American history. Now, many of these women had much different lifestyles, just as we do today. Not all women are the same now. They weren't all the same then. Some of these women were cultured, well-bred, educated women, having grown up in lovely Victorian homes, sometimes with servants, active social schedules. Others were warm-hearted, simple-minded army girls. They had been the daughter of a military man. And still others were silly, frivolous, vapid society girls thinking only of themselves. But they all came together to form the Ladies on Officers' Row. And many of these women wrote their memoirs, particularly the women who enjoyed the lives. Now, the women who didn't particularly care for the life saw no need to. So I would strongly encourage you, if you find yourself interested and intrigued by these women, that you go out and read some of these memoirs, and I'll mention some of the titles throughout the evening. I do have a reading list, and if we run out, I'm sure they would run off extra in the visitor center. But they're fascinating. Some of these women are humorous. Some of them are storytellers. Some of them are very passionate about their lives and how they grew as women out here, which is tremendous. Back east, they were nothing more than dependents of their husbands. Just somebody that kind of sat on the cushion at social events. Out here, they were allowed to make decisions, act on those decisions. Their husband depended on them because often he was gone. They grew tremendously, and these women really, many of them, found themselves just delighted with the experience. Even if they had to put up with hardships, it was worth it. So as I said, you might consider reading some of these. Now, life on a frontier military post was considered a monotonous routine, relieved only ever so slightly by the color of periodic ceremony. And this applied to the men and the women, but more importantly, the women. Because these men, obviously, they had a job out here. And I will say that neither sex was very well educated as what to expect when they got here. Now, the military men knew they had a job. These women had no idea. Absolutely no idea. And it was a shock to the system in many cases. Now, I would like to share with you Ada's first encounter with the respected War Chief Red Cloud. Red Cloud made his appearance at Fort Laramie for the first time along with Redleaf. Red Cloud was a plain-looking Indian of about 40 years of age, standing about 6 foot tall. He seldom spoke even when spoken to. Redleaf, on the other hand, was completely different. He was a short Indian, full of beads and finery, and he had a smile, but she described it as a fiendish smile. Although she said he had a fatherly countenance, which is kind of a dichotomy to me. But you get the idea of these men. But she raved about Red Cloud's smile. In fact, she mentioned it in her diary and everything. And if you saw pictures, now I know the light is horrible tonight. Red Cloud is on the front of my notebook. And if you saw him, you'd never guess in a million years that he had a delightful smile. A smile of any kind, but much less delightful. So that's very important. But now let's take a look at Ada Voges herself. She's the protagonist of our program tonight. And she was a real force of nature. She saw herself much differently than other people saw her. She saw herself as demure and fearful. And oh my gosh, what she ran into an Indian. While other people saw her as a real, a force of nature. She'd take on anything. So, let's take a closer look at her. An introduction. The frontier life, as she said, was terrible for such a nervous person as herself. Why, it seems as if I couldn't endure it any longer. My 2 years with the Indians were the bane of my existence. And this was uttered by a woman that not only invited them into her house, but traded with them and often spoke of them in glowing terms. Now, Ada, while at Fort Laramie, entertained herself playing croquet, ice skating, and participating in amateur theatricals. She didn't suffer fools gladly, but she could be a kind and giving friend. In the end, her actions spoke louder than her words. So, I bring you Ada Bogus. I, Ada Bogus, stand before you a near-perfect specimen of an Army officer's wife. Not military issue, mind you, but still good enough. Having endured bone-jarring traveling conditions, extremes in the weather that neither my nor my hide can endure, I have come to you tonight as a full-blown woman of the West. Now, after all, I had what you might call an epiphany. I had, after all, enlisted in this man's army the minute I uttered the words I do. And for better or worse, I was going to make a go of it. Now, don't misunderstand me. That doesn't mean I've given up grumbling, complaining, or whining. But rather, when used correctly, they are a blessed release, much the same as you would experience when removing a corset that had been laced too tight. I choose to face the situation head on. Why, right here at Fort Laramie, when over 200 warriors gathered for a council, I found myself parleying in my parlor with Red Cloud, Red Leaf, and Old Crow. They were as curious to know how we lived as we were fascinated by their appearance. Sensing an opportunity within my grasp, I traded a button off my coat to Red Leaf for an arrow. Another warrior to whom I gave a button affixed it to the outside of the blue soldier coat he had on and seemed as pleased as Punch. Why, a couple of months later, I raced around all day to secure an Indian blanket work with beads and succeeded in doing so for a bag of flour, 25 pounds of bacon, some coffee, and sugar. I was a firm affairs trader. All negotiations should go so well. After all, I am the belle of the red man on the plains. So I think you kind of get an idea of Miss Ada and her pluck out here on the West. Now, wives, as I said, were not all the same. But adaptation was required out here. If you were going to survive, if you were going to make it, if you were going to be at all happy out here, you had to realize what your circumstances were and make the best of it. For instance, some of these wives, one, for instance, in Kansas, was sitting at Fort Laramie doing her handwork, and all of a sudden the room became dark. Now, these windows were just like these windows, 6 overs, 6 panes over 6 panes. She turned around, and there was an Indian face in each pane of that window, staring in at her. Then, pretty soon, they wandered into the room. They circled up, sat on the floor, and passed the pipe. She was horrified. When they were through, they got up, left. She ran into the next apartment, and one of the officers, and she told him her sad tale, and she said, just relax, be calm. If you're calm, you'll be calm. You just have to get used to it, and that's what they quickly learned. They just had to get used to it. Now, Ada Bogus kept a 2-year diary. They were only out here for about 2 years. They had a small stint at C.F. Smith on the Bozeman, but most of the time they were at Fort Laramie. When they left here, they went from Tennessee to Arkansas, and finally he ended up his career as a general commanding the Department of San Diego in California. Now, if you're not aware, back then, the West was divided up into departments. And they would have commanders, and this is where he ended up. But she kept a wonderful diary. Now, she didn't write her memoirs, which is sad, and no one has really written an extensive account of her, although there are articles in journals and magazines that have been written about her. But through the Park Service, I was able to obtain her diary, and I would like to share this entry with you from July 14th, 1870. A large number of Sioux came in yesterday, among them some of the big chiefs. They have just returned from Washington. I had them to lunch this a.m. Amongst them was Red Cloud, Reed Dog, Red Shirt, Grass, and Brave Bear. They had just come from Mrs. C's, where one would have thought they could have gotten all they could eat. But no, they came here, and the way they did eat donuts, preserves, and drink tea was funny. I told the interpreter to tell Red Cloud that my father tried to see him while he was in New York, but the crowd was so great that he could not get close. Yes, says Red Cloud. The people were so thick as the fingers on his two hands, holding his hands close together as he spoke. Now, going to the plains with their husbands were by horseback, army ambulance, or railroad. And army women often felt they were going out of this world or to the end of the world. It was no man's land to them in many ways. Soon, however, even posted at garrisons with rat-infested dugouts for housing. They came to love the plains and the life in the frontier army. Now, the women's letters, diaries, and later memoirs tell of their love for the army and the plains, surprisingly enough. They were proud of their mission and felt a part of the process of historical change in the West. In addition, Army officers' wives found a degree of personal freedom that few women east of the Mississippi ever experienced. They echoed Frances Rowe, an officer's wife's declaration, "I love the Army life here in the West. I love all the things it brings me. The grand mountains, the plains, and the fine hunting." Now, life on Officers' Row kind of became home. You have to remember these people were far away from friends and family back east. The only communication back then were letters, when you got them. So in times of tragedy, sadness, loss, even happiness and success, they shared them with their fellow officers. They became a family on Officers' Row. But there were rules. The commanding officer had the right to call these women down if he thought she was stepping out of line. Sometimes he was a little fearful to do so. But there were rules to follow nonetheless. Now, life on a frontier military post was a microcosm of the larger world. The same thing was happening here, only on a smaller scale that was happening back east in Boston, Philadelphia, New York. You know, there was murder, there was mayhem, there was infidelity, there was crime, there was stealing. And it had to be dealt with, but was usually dealt with in the military manner. Now, sometimes what creates the greatest challenges and provides the greatest also rewards, and grows in ways we previously not thought possible. Children often formed a common ground for mothers of all ethnicities. But children were also able, through their innocence, to convey thoughts, ideas, and messages adults were unable to do. We were told of a grieving mother at Fort Rice. She had gone to the cemetery to tend her baby's grave. The cemetery also served the Arikara scouts and families. The mother was startled to see an Arikara man there in full battle regalia, standing in a grave visiting someone who was apparently very important to him. He asked her about her child and paid his respect along with her, and then walked her back to her post. She invited him into the house and gave him food. She also made sure that he was not detained by the guards on his way out because he had shown her great respect and kindness. So now you see these bridges. And this is happening in the second half of the 19th century. I think we probably fell down all of this in the 20th century, but now people are coming together to try to make friends, to understand the differences between ourselves and the Indians, and to form a bridge and make greater friendships. But babies brought the two cultures together. It is hard to demonize an Indian where a baby is concerned. And I have a couple of stories that I think will relate this concept to you. Captain Richard Pratt and his wife were working at their home at Fort Arbuckle with the outer door open. And they noticed a most miserable and repulsive squaw approach. As the Kiowa woman scooped up the Pratt baby, who was laying in a cradle there, the officer's wife sprang forward and reclaimed her daughter. The poor, miserable woman looked at the mother in a most pitiful manner. Then, gathering up the corner of her blanket, she held it as if you would hold a sick child. And by using signs, she indicated that her baby had died. And she made a terrible crooning and mournful cry. And to show how great her grief was, she had cut off her little finger at the second joint. And this is one of the extreme mourning signs of the Kiowa people. The sympathies grew for this woman. And they were so moved that they almost unconsciously replaced the baby in her hands. Tenderly and carefully, the bereaved Indian mother handled the baby as she passed her hands over the plump little limbs. After some moments, she handed her back with a grateful look and a hearty handshake. She departed. 1 week later, the Kiowa woman returned with a basket of wild plums for the Pratts. Again, she held the Pratt baby, and this time, with signs, asked permission if she might be permitted to kiss the child. For this sorrowing Indian mother was no longer repulsive. Another week passed, and she returned with 2 buffalo tongues, asking only the chance to hold the baby. So you can see now we're making inroads. Officers' wives brought with them home, school, churches, social customs, and traditions. Their husbands were out here on a purpose. They were military men. That's what they were focused on. They didn't care about community. But communities arose because these women were here. Even though the army was not particularly thrilled, these husbands were happier if they could have their wives with them and their families. And initially, these forts were constructed without officers' row. But when the military knew they could no longer hold them back, they started making these officers' rows. And with them came some interesting innovations too. A tradition developed called ranking out, and this was in effect until World War II. Now that meant if an officer and his wife came to post and there was no housing available for him, but he found he outranked somebody, all he had to do is go up to the door, knock, and say, "My wife and family and I are here. There's no housing available for us, and I find I outrank you, and you're going to have to move."
Oh, ouch.
And this all took place within a few hours. And sometimes it caused a domino effect as another rank on down the line. And you were grateful by the end of the day to have a tent or even a chicken house to call home. So it could be a little hard, particularly on the women. But Again, one of the traditions of the time. But as I said, these women were a civilizing effect. Elizabeth Burt wrote, "A true army women they adopted to military customs, supported their husbands' careers, and often referred to themselves as good soldiers," meaning that they learned to be strong in the face of danger and separation from friends and family. Ellen Biddle addressed the subject by writing, "Some of them dressed in gowns sewn from army blue cloth that mimicked the style of their officer husbands' uniforms with gold braid and brass buttons in double lines on the bodice." And my jacket is a resemblance of that, a little differently constructed, but still with the same thought and idea. They topped these outfits with forage caps. They embraced the army as part of their identity. And though they sometimes were troubled with doubts about the army mission when it included the destruction of the Indian way of life, they worked in their own unique ways to bring the cultures together. Even though they lived differently, behaved differently, dressed differently, and these women made sacrifices to make this life work. And even out here in the middle of nowhere, they were expected to entertain in a reasonable fashion, to host dinners, dances, and even entertainments. And sometimes they would take for a table 2 sawhorses, planks, and then their fine linens to cover the table. But even the military custom of entertaining and being a proper lady was in place. And their officers' husbands and they often share the same views about life. I'm told down at Fort Larned, Indians were coming in to get their annuities from the government, from the Indian agent. And one of the officers said, "We may have to fight them tomorrow, but I will not see them starve today." So this kind of disrupts the feeling that you've always got, that there was pure hatred between these people. There was no thought, there was no concern, there was no kindness, there was no sympathy, when in fact, in many cases, it was developing. And like I said, I think it fell down in the 20th century, and hopefully we're picking it back up in the 21st century. I would now like to introduce you to another officer's wife, Lydia Spencer Lane. Now, Lydia Spencer Lane's courage, sense of humor, her power of observation, and her obvious love of the Western landscape make her a valuable historian, an example of strength under pressure. Lydia met her husband when he was stationed at Carlisle Barracks. They courted and married and came west prior to the Civil War, taking postings in either West Texas or eastern New Mexico. At the outbreak of the Civil War, they returned to the Eastern Front, and as conclusion, they again came west, taking similar postings in Texas and New Mexico. Now, her memoirs are entitled, "I Married a Soldier." And it's a very thin volume, but she's a wonderful storyteller and very, very humorous in many instances. And her book was one of the first of its kind to be published in 1893, and then followed some of these other officers' wives. I now bring you Lydia Spencer Lane. Introduction to frontier military life is somewhat akin to being awakened by a bucket of ice-cold water. It is a shock to the system that seriously will not seriously harm you, but will certainly bring you to attention. Nothing in my previous life as Lydia Spencer could have prepared me for the challenges I would face as Lydia Spencer Lane, wife of Lieutenant William Bartlett Lane. My personal obstacles could be as elemental as brocking biscuits in a Dutch oven. I might add with the equally inept assistance of my Irish servant Mike. But never let it be said that our enthusiasm or obvious lack of skill was deterred by a few blackened and burned biscuits. Why, we kept at it till we persuaded the bachelor officers to sample our wares. But not without the help of an ample amount of molasses. Of course, other situations required more of me. When my husband went on an Indian scout and left me in command of the sergeant and the 10 men who remained at Fort Fillmore, New Mexico, not only was I given control of public funds, but the sergeant reported to me each day.
Wow.
I took my responsibilities and I was ready to die to protect the money entrusted to my care. It's funny how without realizing it, we assume we're given roles and carry on as if we were born to them. At Fort Stanton, Mescalero Apache sat on my front porch and watched me through their windows, their painted noses flattened against the glass. A sudden noise caught my attention, and I discovered they had wandered into the house, and I can tell you I did not use much ceremony in putting them out again. This occurrence, again, would have been an exceptional experience for Lydia Spencer, but was considered as everyday by Lydia Spencer Lane. It was a life I had come to know and count on. But those days were past. And as I packed away the relics of my Army days, I discovered a small battered tin box used to carry our lunch when moving from camp to camp. As I raised the lid, a faint odor seemed to rise from its depths. And in a second memory, I was busy with the past, traveling back to the old happy days when little tired, hungry children with eager outstretched hands stood by my side waiting to be served. With a sigh, I closed the box, setting it aside as worthless to be thrown away. But the tender recollections awakened by the old friend were too strong. Hurriedly seizing it, I cleared a comfortable corner in the chest and replaced the worn-out box, retiring it like an old soldier from active service forever. Now, Catherine Figuera reported that while her husband was escorting a number of Ponca prisoners, one woman dropped out of line and disappeared behind a bush. When she reappeared, she was holding a baby. He felt sorry for her. He placed her in a wagon and gave her some water. When Catherine, his wife, gave birth, the Ponca husband returned the favor by sending beaver skins as a gift for the baby, a gesture that deeply touched the officer husband. Catherine's husband gripped the rough Indian's hand and said, "Again, let me thank you for your gift, and my squaw thanks you. And may the Great Spirit prosper you and bring you good hunting." So, again, not all the encounters between whites and Indians back there were dramatic or horrific or terrifying. Martha Summerhays remembered one significant incident. She was languishing in her bed after giving birth, and she was rather weepy and quite uncertain how to cope with her new fretting baby. The 7th day after the birth of her child, a delegation of Apache squaws, wives of chiefs, came to pay a formal visit. They brought with them some finely woven baskets and a beautiful papoose basket or cradle, such as they used to carry their own babies. And it was some of their very best work. She admired it and tried to express to them her great thanks. These squaws then took the baby, who was laying next to Martha in the bed. Then, cooing and chuckling, they looked about the room until they found a small pillow, which they laid in the basket cradle. Then they put the baby in and drew the flaps around and laced him tightly in. Then stood it up and laid it down and laughed again in their gentle way, and finally soothed him to sleep. Martha was quite touched by the friendliness of it all. Another encounter that Martha had was she, her husband, and another couple were being transferred from one post to another. Each couple had a baby. The men were on horseback, the women were in a wagon. As they were traveling down the road, they looked ahead and they saw Indians approaching. They had no idea if they were friendly or not, or what to expect. So the men put the women and the babies in the back of the wagon and covered them up. Martha's husband came to her with a gun and handed it to her, and he said, if we're overwhelmed, shoot the baby and then shoot yourself. Martha looked at that gun and she said, there is no way that I can shoot this baby. And so they patiently waited. The Indians came up and they were friendly. And they passed without incident. So the fear that she most had was unwarranted, at least this time. The Indians were curious as to how the white man lived. And both men and women, and contact and familiarity and better understanding helped to alleviate officers' wives' fears and concerns. But the one thing that remained constant was a fearful dread of watching their husbands ride off in pursuit of errant Indians. Their benevolence did have its limitations. Now, Alice Baldwin, her book is entitled The Long March. Now, the one thing about Alice's book is she was very frank. Now, a lot of these women still had the Victorian way, they told the story in the proper manner. She just told it the way it was. Now, her husband, Frank Baldwin, was a 2-time Medal of Honor winner. He won his first medal in the Civil War, his second medal during the Red River Wars in the Panhandle of Texas. And as I said, Alice was very, very frank. And she expressed surprise at her composure when her husband was ordered out on detail. She had read that these women had hysterics and swooned and cried and were bathed in tears in these times of danger. But instead, you know what her thought was? I think I'll have a piece of pie.
Bye, dear.
So she sat down and had a piece of apple pie. And it was only when her husband returned unharmed that she broke down in hysterics and wild sobs. Even though the menfolk had previously praised and complimented her for her pluck. So it could go, it was stressful, no doubt, out here, and in these situations. But, as I said, these women, many of them adapted. The ones who didn't sometimes returned back east, leaving their husbands to live a bachelor lifestyle out here. They didn't separate or divorce, but the ones who stayed, that wrote the books, they're the ones that, tell us the most fascinating stories and interesting tales. Now, I would like to introduce you to Elizabeth Reynolds Burt, and they were stationed here. The Burt House is up the road. They were here on 2 different occasions, staying in the same house. They were the first ones to live in the house. Others lived there too, but it became known as the Burt House. Her personal account gives us a unique view of Army life, everything from travel, life in garrison, children, entertainment, and the foot soldier. As an added treat, her recollections are not without their occasional humorous moments. Elizabeth vowed at the time of her marriage to Andrew that she would always remain by his side. She was true to her word, and her knowledge is enriched by experiences alongside her husband in the Frontier Army. It seems that much of my life revolved around Indians, infants, and infantry. I had followed my husband from one lonely post to another, with 3 small children, a crate of chickens, and a cow in tow. Now I ask you, is that any way to travel? Well, to us it seemed only natural. Speaking of traveling, I must share this small tidbit with you concerning my departure from Fort Russell to join my husband at Lodgepole Creek. Seated in the ambulance, waiting for the signal to move out, General Gibbon came and ceremoniously presented me with a bottle of gin, saying it was for baby when she had colic. But General, I never used gin. To which he quickly replied, "Then you don't know what a blessing it will prove. I've raised a large family out here in the West, and I know." So, on a more somber note, along the Bozeman Trail, we halted at the crest of the hill overlooking Fort C. of Smith. We had just bid farewell to the entire Crow tribe gathered in gala attire. One proudly looking chief seemed more than a little proud as he walked under the protection of my discarded brown silk umbrella. Soon after our departure, the forts along the Bozeman Trail were put to the torch by the Sioux. On a domestic note, our little baby daughter Eva seemed always to be at the center of a great deal of attention. At Fort C.F. Smith, she was the first and only white baby. Mrs. Crazyhead expressed through an interpreter her wish to hold baby Edith. As she was passed from one squaw to the next, their admiration for the child grew. Kisses were not permitted. I personally have never seen an Indian woman kiss her child, nor have I seen one punished. Crazyhead himself astonished my husband by asking to buy our blessed baby, offering first 20 ponies and then 30 ponies. Andrew, using signs, ordered him to leave the camp at once, at which point we feared our children might be stolen. The thought tormented my mind. But you might be pleased to know that the little fair-haired baby girl with hazel eyes would remain a daughter of the regiment by eventually becoming the bride of Lieutenant Trout of the 9th Cavalry. The stories of our military adventures are far too numerous to mention in a single setting. They require a book, don't you think? But all the trials and tribulations seemed worth it. When my husband, who referred to me as the commander, the wife who had gone gloriously over the world with him, just as he had written a quarter of a century before, repeated me for the last loving time before he died. But by God, the commander went through it all. So you get a feeling of the relationships, the feelings that developed here that often aren't thought about. Now we returned to our good friend Ada Burgess, again the protagonist of our program. She said that fording streams out here in the West were like fording streams in the Holy Land. The sunflowers are as thick that it appears the grass has a yellow gauze over it. So my journey is to Fort Laramie. I came out here in a spring wagon and was bounced about like an Indian rubber ball, being unable to keep my seat for any length of time. I was congratulating myself while being tossed about that I had neither false teeth or a wig, both of which I was sure would have been shook off or out. One clear starlit night, I was outside the tent and was playing my guitar when I was frightened out of my wits by an unholy commotion. But instead of Indians, it proved to be 2 company cooks who were drunk and firing at random. Such is the life in the wilds of the West. I, along with Ada, hope we have given you another look at the 19th century conquest of the plains. That maybe we haven't always heard the whole and all the story. And I would like to leave you with this final image. The Indians came over this AM to hold council. They came up the hill singing at the top of their voices, arranged in 4 battalions. We raised our eyes to the hill from which they came, and we welcomed them, not as enemies, but with the hope of better understanding and benevolence. Thank you. Are there any quick questions? Yes. What?
Were you?
No.
Were you in the cavalry?
No. So, but yes, I strongly encourage you to read some of these books, to look further into the subject, because, you know, we're looking right now at a time with greater understanding and reaching out to those people that maybe before we have ignored or sold short. And we find that it was happening a long time ago. Only trouble is it hasn't been highly publicized. And as Casey was telling you, I like to look at the female and the dependent side of the story. And I really wanted to tell this story about how things can change. They can be different. We can reach out to others and build a bridge and friendships and a hope and better understanding for the future. Thank you.
I have another question.
Yes.
Did you notice about the fire?
Do I, what?
Did you notice about the fire?
About the fire? No, I don't know too much about fire. Like Casey was telling you, I came in from Kansas. So I just...
And it is stop lightning and stop thundering nearly entirely. I say nearly, not because I've heard it recently, but because if I say it entirely, as soon as I come out, we're going to hear it. So I'm going to say nearly. And then where the rain's down to spitting. Now, if you don't want to walk around in spitting rain, that's fine. You are welcome to, head out now. It is 8:40. So, and if you want to head out as we leave, please don't leave right this second. But as you leave, if you want to head out, no one will take offense. We are going to split us into two groups to do our tour from there. I'll take one, Rob will take the other, and you'll see where we go from there. We're not going to go all about the fort, just to make sure that the rain picks up again. We're not caught, on the other side of the fort at that point. So, if we can if you're closer to the back, file out the back, and if you're closer to the front,